Welcome to the Problem Structuring Methods Special Interest Group. We are delighted to be joined by Eleanor Reynolds today, who is going to talk to us about structuring of problems in the sort of the domain of the wicked, messy, swampy situations, and how sort of people kind of are able to deal with those kind of those swampy, messy problems. Something that most of us face, a lot of the time. So it's going to be really fascinating to hear about the way that sort of people go about doing that. So welcome. Eleanor is a teaching fellow at Warwick Business School. Welcome, Eleanor.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you. Would you like me to actually start? Are you ready for me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Here we go then. Okay, so it's a little off-putting that now I can see my slides, but I cannot see anybody. So Martin, please interrupt me if you want me to stop sharing my screen.
Sure.
Am I successfully sharing screen now?
Not at the moment. No, I can't see anything at the moment. So.
Okay, right. Let's try this again then.
It worked perfectly when we demoed this.
When we practiced this, didn't it? Yeah, here we go.
That's good. Yeah, that's great. I can see it. Brilliant. That's good. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So thank you for coming. I hope I'm going to share some interesting things about how people structure problems in an everyday workplace, specifically when we as OR practitioners are not there. So this was a single site ethnographic study, and the analysis that I used on my data was informed by existing literature. And cumulatively, those analyses enabled me to develop an organisational perspective on problem structuring, which I'm hoping could be quite an interesting contrast to the typical intervention perspectives that we tend to see in our traditional OR research. It was a PhD project. I was studying at Warwick Business School. So I would like to thank 3 academics. I don't think any of them are here today, but I'd like to thank Francis O'Brien, Robert Dyson and Leroy White for their various and varied contributions and support during the various stages of my research. I also want to acknowledge Severn Trent Water. They were my industrial sponsors, and they were very generous with their support, but also they were very generous with the amount of freedom they gave me in terms of access and in terms of being quite relaxed about what I did, what data I gathered and what I found. I believe that the thesis that I produced is relatively easy to find. It's available through Warwick Library and it's called Discovering Everyday Problem Structuring. So Severn Trent Water provided the scene of action for my research. And the initial prompt for the observation that I undertook was to ask myself, how do people structure problems in an everyday workplace? I gathered a great deal of data, as you can imagine. I'm not going to share a great deal of the data, but at another time, if anybody does want to see more data, I'm always very willing to share more data. I just don't have time to give a great deal of it today. You may have gathered by now that this study is not about what should happen. It's not about OR practitioners. It's not about method. But it was a great opportunity to gather some real world data to see what was happening in a real world working environment. And my talk today is split into 2 parts, thinking about how we can conceptualize problem structuring in order to identify problem structuring activity. So what is problem structuring really? And the final 3 research questions that evolved during my study, each contributed to the development of this organisational perspective, pursuing the interesting things that I saw in the fieldwork, cumulatively sort of gave this impression that it was very much an organisational practice. It wasn't a method-driven thing. It wasn't a sort of process-driven thing that was happening there. So what is problem structuring? I can answer in my own way, and I'm sure that everybody here can answer in their own way too. I was putting my answer together with a specific purpose in mind. I was trying to develop criteria for identification and comparison. So I began with considering the situation. Then I was thinking about how people respond. In this case, I was interested in the group response. And finally, to enable comparison, I was thinking about typical OR PSM interventions and how people might be using method in those interventions. So going right back to thinking about the situation, I looked first at the elements originally identified by Rittel and Weber. So in the red circles, you can see each of those 10 elements that were identified back in 1973. I began to group those and label them, which you can see in the red boxes at the top. And broadly, I organized them chronologically, thinking about how we might experience a wicked, messy, swampy problem when we encountered one in real life. And as I was ordering that rough chronology, I was thinking, well, this is to an extent, there's a shift between how people are perceiving the situation and how people are responding to the situation. So with this in mind, I turned to a piece of work completed by Mike Yearworth and Leroy White, their constitutive definition elements. So I took those 9 elements and I took liberties with these elements. I organized them into sets, thinking first about the situation, then about the purposefulness of the people encountering this situation, and finally about method, the methods that they were using, how they employed the methods, how knowledgeable they needed to be about the methods. And there was a lot about method. So what happens if I take method away? We're left with this. And what can we do with this? What I did with this was to think about the situation being messy first. Then I've got this central section where I can say, well, there's subjectivity and worldviews. So these worldviews are subjectively expressed. Because I was interested in group situations, I added a piece about multiple stakeholders. I mean, that's not explicitly defined as one of the constitutive elements, but in this instance, I was interested in group response and how people in groups were structuring problems. And then finally, this purposeful improvement activity, I said, okay, there is an intent to improve here. And I thought about how we can understand this as a pretty simple loop. We have a socially complex, wicked, messy, swampy situation. This is triggering a socially situated response to the situation. We have those worldviews being subjectively expressed, and irrespective of whether that group of people, that group of multiple stakeholders, decide to make an intervention to try and implement a change within the situation, we know that even if no response is made, when you have a wicked, messy, swampy situation, it will continue to evolve. So there is that feedback loop, albeit a dotted line to indicate that there may actually be a decision to do nothing. So I thought about this a little and I reconsidered that situation that I was originally looking at, and those originally identified characteristics of wicked, messy, swampy situations. And I thought, well, actually, we're saying that these situations are characterized by uncertainty. But at the moment, there's nothing in there about uncertainty. And there's also nothing in there about the never-ending nature of these situations. The idea that a messy problem, a wicked problem, is vicious like a circle. So I adapted my initial model, adding in 2 further contextual characteristics. I was labeling that feedback loop, never-ending evolution, and encasing the whole in a blob to represent uncertainty. And from that, then, I was able to say, okay, I can make a statement of the required elements for problem structuring. not problem structuring method, just problem structuring. So I've said multiple stakeholders engaging in real world problems, seeking to identify and make desirable and feasible improvements. I should mention, of course, that I'd specified that that was going to be a group, a minimal group problem structuring model. And that's where the multiple stakeholders came from. So then I wanted to set up a comparison. So I returned to the literature again. And here I drew particularly upon Chris Smith and Duncan Shaw's 2019 paper, where they produced a framework for identifying where problem structuring methods had been used. I drew also on other literature, but I particularly made use of that framework that Smith and Shaw had produced. And this added some further elements. So not only do we see the multiple stakeholders, the engagement in real world problems, and the seeking to make an improvement, we're also then seeing that they're building models in facilitated environments within a staged analysis that is formally planned and documented. So as I sought to set up some criteria with which to say, am I seeing problem structuring, and how do I compare that with what I might perceive as a typical OR-PSM intervention, I was able then to say, okay, I have 3 statements about problem structuring, and I have 4 additional statements about what that problem structuring would look like if a PSM was being used. Now, this enabled me to make a number of analyses, and this is a table that I lifted from the thesis. I won't go through each of these rounds of coding, but you can see there broadly that each row was an iteration of my coding effort. And today I want to focus particularly on the final line of that table. So thinking about how the analyses built upon one another to produce this perspective of problem structuring as an organizational activity. So I'm going to move on to share with you fairly briefly some of the details of my analysis. So I mentioned that I had an awful lot of data. This is a tiny little snippet of that data. I tried to organize all the different observations that I'd made. And if you remember, I wasn't looking at particular interventions, I was observing a workplace. So although I tried to follow particular groups of people, particular projects, perhaps particular initiatives, it wasn't within that sort of tidy boundary that I might have found if I'd said, I am following project X. So within my data set, I produced themes. And one of these themes was True North. I was looking at an innovation team. So they were interested in identifying and managing and delivering projects that were going to produce innovation in the waste and water treatment processes. So I took that label True North from the dialogue that I heard in the workplace. They were saying, well, we need to be navigating towards True North as we're creating the right balance and deciding what's really going to align with our longer term goals and what innovation we need to be funding and researching. So if I sort of follow around the red numbers that I've got on this diagram, not really a diagram, is it? It's like a pseudo-rich picture. Obviously, I've got the quotes on because I need to provide the link back to my source data. But there was a lot of messiness going on there around the objectives and the direction and the funding for the work that they were doing. If I move on to the number 2 there, I've got that quote, it's a bad time to kill a coliforms project. So there were the politics of the here and now that were interfering in their ability to keep focused on some of the longer term objectives that they had in mind. Number 3, I've got some ideas here that are all around the exercise of autonomy. That wonderful quote that somebody says, "That's the joy of my role. I'm going to do it anyway." He's not interested in whether everyone else agrees. He's going to do it anyway. The frustration when someone says, "How did this get going outside of the front-end innovation process?" These were the sorts of situations that I was seeing people struggle to engage with on a daily basis in their work. There were also issues around the number 4 there, around agreeing the scope, the remit, the process, the resource allocation, how things were going to be measured. And was everybody willing to undertake these projects in the way that was desired? So I've got Team Z don't want to do the enterprise resource planning stuff. They just want to run the trial. They were so caught up with the technology that they were not perhaps gathering the data that the innovation team needed in order to build a business case to roll out at other sites. Then numbers 5 and 6, we have resource issues, which are perhaps not a surprise, but they were quite emotionally felt. I've got the quote there that someone said, "I'm not going to even ask that team for resource at the moment. It will be like poking a hornet's nest." And then we've also got implementation issues. How well has the situation really been comprehended? Should this have been 8 or 800 installations? The question's still lingering after the project has finished. So I made quite a detailed analysis to show that these people were faced with messy situations and that they were actually structuring problems, albeit without the assistance of OR practitioners, and definitely they were not following PSM approaches. And over the various different data sets and examples that I analysed, I found that there were some striking differences. Fortunately for me, there was definitely a resemblance there in those areas that I identified as required elements. There were multiple stakeholders involved. They were really very seriously engaged in dialogue concerning these real-world messes that they were faced with. And they were definitely intent on identifying and implementing improvements. I could see that through the action logs that they were agreeing, through the debates that they were having about the solutions that they favoured. But when it came to those 4 further elements that were typical to ORPSM use, there were definitely differences. I've got the green box highlighted there to say, in a less closely controlled activity, the participants had greater opportunity to shape process as well as content. And significantly, the use of artifacts that were produced outside of the immediate group was perceived to represent an influence from the wider organisation. So it was not just the immediate group that I was observing who were influencing the course of the problem structuring. It was the people who had produced artifacts that were referenced within that dialogue. So from that data, I managed to build a rather complex looking new model. And this was my model of everyday problem structuring. So I have in there the required elements again, and I identified different sources of uncertainty. It was clear that people were concerned with their comprehension of the situation, but also in the uncertainty that surrounded how stakeholders and different teams might respond to the solutions they were proposing. It was also evident that they were recognising that no matter how much they modelled, how much they thought through the changes that they wanted to implement, there was nevertheless uncertainty around how the situation would evolve. And they were definitely engaged in this never-ending cycle, coming back to a problem month after month after month. I should perhaps have mentioned that I think this was about 21 months that I spent studying this workplace. So I moved on from that sort of initial phase of analysis to look in a little bit more detail at some of the data and some specific snippets of dialogue. So the first analysis I'm showing here was inspired by John Minger's article in 2001. It was actually building upon a previous article that he'd written with John Brocklesby in 1997, I think. Sorry, I should perhaps have used that reference, not the 2001. So I was beginning from the phases of problem structuring that Minger's had identified. And within this excerpt of data that I was using here, I identified sort of 3 distinct stages in what was happening, the conversations that were being had by the groups of people involved. So when they were talking about objectives and plans, I had a number of observations. That's the D references here. Each D reference was a date of a particular observation. And the E references, each identifies an extant artifact, something that existed in the organisation prior to this discussion, prior to this structuring of a particular problem, whether that be to identify winners for an idea generation competition, which projects were going to receive funding, whether it was to identify what the top objectives were for the coming business plan, or whether it was a question of governance. In each of these different types of discussion, I was seeing over and over again that the extant artifacts, things like existing performance measures, existing policies, the current 5-year business plan, the executive-driven strategic objectives for the organisation, were structuring or almost creating a prior landscape of appreciating the context of the problem situation. And that's perhaps not a big surprise. Wasn't really a big surprise to me, but here was the evidence to say these people within their problem structuring are using these extant artifacts. They're referring to them. Sometimes this was not explicit, and it was only when I was myself familiar with those artifacts that I could realise that within a meeting somebody might be quoting almost word for word a section of one of these artifacts in support of a proposal or an objection that they were putting forward in relation to the activity at the time. Lower down the diagram, I've got these S references, and these were references to artifacts that they were producing within the group, and these were much more firmly focused upon analysis of the situation, assessment of the different courses of action that they might take, and in fact the action itself. So out of this analysis grew this idea that there was a wider appreciation that was informing multiple cycles then of analysis, assessment and action. And I've represented that in the diagram on the right there. Another piece of more detailed analysis was inspired by the boundary games analysis undertaken by Velez, Castiblanco, Brocklesby and Midgley in 2016. This was a very, very different from their analysis. The original analysis that they had done was much more detailed. It took line by line transcript and was analysing each utterance. The analysis that I did took a much broader approach. I was following whole sections of dialogue. So this piece here, it was a meeting where people were scoring different ideas that had been generated for innovation-based projects. So these actions 1 to 16 were probably taking place over, I'm just looking at the detail, probably about 45 minutes. So a much broader analysis of the dialogue that was taking place. But similarly to Velez Castablanco et al., I was seeing that through that dialogue there was a branching of ideas, that we perceive the situation as being problematic in this respect, but also in this respect, a shifting. Is that really the issue here, or is it perhaps actually this discussion sort of coalescing over a slightly different perception of the situation? And then synthesis, the idea that two issues are actually part of one larger issue and can be expressed as one. What I was also seeing, and remember that this was a relatively informal facilitation or perhaps no facilitation environment, I also saw ambiguity there, where there were unresolved acts and implied actions. So somebody suggested a different way to set a boundary on the problem scope or the formulation, or they implied that a change should be made, and perhaps other people in the conversation went along with that, but it wasn't explicitly stated, and perhaps it wasn't recorded in an action log, where, albeit in a situation where actually to make that change, some follow-on action needed to be undertaken. So this was interesting, because I believe that in a sort of participative modelling situation where you have quite a strong level of facilitatory control, these types of unresolved and implied actions would have been more thoroughly explored. The question then remains as to whether this ambiguity was a good thing or a bad thing. Of course, that's a very subjective judgment. I didn't make that judgment. I was looking at the data simply. The other thing that I noticed was that participants were aligning with these extant artifacts. As I mentioned before, they were using pre-existing documents, posters, events, sometimes memories of things that had gone before to justify their positions. And again, I don't think this would surprise anybody, but it's perhaps something that is less explicit when we undertake an OR PSM intervention. So people were aligning with the artifacts or realigning if they'd realised that what they were proposing was slightly out of kilter with the stated strategic objectives for the organisation. There was also instances in which there was misalignment or non-alignment, that members of the group actually disagreed with the status quo and wished to change that. So through these analyses, I'm beginning to build a picture then of everyday problem structuring. There's that initial analysis, broadly looking at the data and saying, is problem structuring actually happening here? How is it different from what we might expect to see? That brought to me the ideas that it's a less formal and non-explicit activity, that it's cyclical, there's an ongoing engagement there. It also brought that idea that there's a cyclicality in concern with the sources of uncertainty about the comprehension. Do we need to do more analysis? Uncertainty around how stakeholders would respond. Uncertainty about, well, what would happen if we went for this, if we made this change. Then I have this idea of appreciation being integrated with, but somewhat separate from the analysis, assessment and action. This idea that there's something collectively understood about the types of situations that they're engaging with that carries forward from one episode of problem structuring to another. And finally, this idea of the use of extant artifacts. And overall, this began then to give a picture that was suggesting an ongoing becoming rather than a time-bound intervention. This idea that I was looking beyond a specific intervention was there right from the start in the design of the research. But in the data, I was beginning to feel that actually we could look at problem structuring as an intervention, think about formulating a problem, solving a problem, and implementing a solution. Or we could go back to some of these words that exist in the literature. I think probably people would recognize and associate these mainly with Rosakov, when he's thinking about dissolving or resolving problems and this never-ending evolution of situations. So here I'm thinking of perhaps problem structuring as an ongoing mess management rather than a project-based, here's an intervention, here's the beginning, the end, and then maybe we'll have another one later. But actually, in the scenes of action that I was observing, it was a continuous thing. It was never-ending engagement in this. So this was perhaps, I suppose, the tail end of my analysis, where I just had a couple of illustrations of this idea rather than a fully detailed analysis. But for example, I've got a number of sort of episodes within this leak stop project that they're putting together a proposal, the idea submission, they're developing some tests, testing this product, identifying that they need to do further research, and requesting funding to progress that research. And on the final line there, for example, I have this view of the technical experts. They were a little bit dubious about this innovation. It had been developed by a group of field workers, so relatively low in the organizational hierarchy, but really very well connected with the problem that they were trying to solve. You know, they were encountering problems every day, whereby they went to customers' properties, there was a leak on the supply pipe under somebody's driveway. So it wasn't actually their responsibility to fix it, but they wanted to be able to offer these householders something, because it's pretty worrying if you've got a leak running under your driveway. You're responsible for all that water use, you're responsible for the repair. And they wanted to be able to offer those customers an easy and quick solution. They came up with an idea. The technical experts were a little bit dubious. They were aware that throughout around the company there was a lot of popular support, but they were concerned that there had not been sufficient attention to the technical details. But actually, following this project for a number of months, I could see that concern was being dissolved. They were reassured by the proposed research objectives, the details of the research proposal that was submitted. So, also looking more closely at aligning there, this leak stop idea definitely aligned with company priority areas, but the product itself didn't align with specific company policies. So it's definitely misaligned. Those pink boxes identify. There you can see that view from the technical experts, that actually the popularity vote has got this one through, and they actually have some concerns about the technical feasibility. There were some potentially legal issues relating to competition law about implementing this problem. On the other hand, there were some groups that were very excited about this project and already wanted to try and scale it and use it on larger pipes and use it more. And of course, the idea developers, they wanted it on their vans yesterday. So it was an interesting project to follow, in the sense that there was this misalignment, and in fact, there was eventually a non-alignment, that it began to be the case that people thought that this BOPS policy, the burst on private property policy, might actually be changed as a result of pursuing this particular innovation, this particular idea. So this idea about alignment gave, I suppose, a final piece to the jigsaw about my ideas about how everyday problem structuring could be perceived as a practice. So we have a community of people experiencing everyday involvement in wicked, messy, swampy problems within this organisation. Their practice lacks formal problem structuring roles and design, but they are clearly, well, I say clearly, it's clear within the data that they were applying relevant knowledge and skills. It's clear that they were using extant artifacts alongside that relevant knowledge and skill. And there came this idea that they were maintaining and evolving this idea of collective prior appreciation through the influence that they had on the interpretation and the development of new artifacts. So whether they were producing a slightly different interpretation of an existing document, or whether they were proposing definite changes or replacement of some documents, there was this idea or sort of presence of constant change, that a policy today might not be a policy tomorrow. And of course, together, this sort of less formal in comparison to ORPSM's approach, but use of extant artifacts, was all aimed at developing shared goals and commitment to action within their ongoing mess management efforts. And finally, really the very last piece of analysis, again using the leak stop illustration, I was thinking about how these acts of alignment enabled that maintenance and evolution. So they're providing an input to the everyday problem structuring dialogue, but they are also constituting a collective prior appreciation that's maintained and evolved as it is used in the problem structuring dialogue. Through these acts of alignment, people sort of support or detract from existing ideas and existing perceptions, and in fact may produce self-generated artifacts that could become the influential extant artifacts of the future. So the best example I had within my data of this was a series of posters that the innovation team produced. And they were thinking, well, actually, some of our aspirations are not actually ambitious enough. So they produced a series of posters which they circulated and promoted within the executive team. And just as I was finishing my fieldwork, I believed that these were going to become an important artifact of the future, as they were in fact having a big influence upon the development of the next 5-year business plan. The final point I wanted to make on this slide was in relation to this leak stop analysis, that there was quite a lot of ambiguity there. So again, is that ambiguity good or bad? There were these issues that when I was observing dialogue, they were just sort of sidelined and not discussed. So there was a query about the BOPS policy, but it was not followed up upon. There was a query about whether this technology could be scaled up, should be scaled up. There was a query about competition law. And these were all sort of placed on hold, pending the development of the business case and the investigation of some of the technical issues. So there was quite an interesting tension there, that people definitely believed that these issues were important, but at that stage of development, they were happy to leave them as rather ambiguous areas. So overall then, I developed this organizational perspective on problem structuring, the idea that it's an ongoing becoming situated in the flux of organizational events and ideas, that there's a cycle of uncertainty and mismanagement going on here. I've explicitly identified here the extant artifacts and self-generated artifacts being used within episodes of everyday problem structuring. We've also here then got the idea of purposeful people making a practice of problem structuring. And in this particular organisation, this was what it was looking like. It may be that in many of the organisations we're familiar with as OR practitioners, we might expect a problem structuring practice to be rather more formal, and perhaps to be using specific PSMs or specific tools. It's interesting that in this organisation, although they were not using PSM tools, they were definitely using lean tools, they were definitely using project management tools, and there were quite a lot of things that we might recognise as hard OR applications with simulation and other types of modelling going on. Also, of course, in this particular organisation, I was seeing that extant artifact use, and I developed this idea of a collective prior appreciation that was being maintained and evolved. It'd be very interesting for me to see how that would compare in a different organisation. Within the constraints of a PhD project, this was a single site ethnography. So something there perhaps to be looked at again. Important then for me, though, was this idea that these extant artifacts seemed to be having multiple use and multiple relevance to different cycles of problem structuring activity. And finally then, the ideas about how collective prior appreciation might be maintained and evolved. In that particular area, I probably do have enough data that I could continue that analysis within the confines of the thesis. I wasn't able to do that. However, thank you all for listening. Do ask me questions if you would like to. Martin, do you want me to continue sharing screen or stop now?
It's probably we could stop just as we move into the questions, I think.
Yeah,
So
okay.
huge thank you, Eleanor. I think that's fascinating. I've got a whole heap of questions there around. Wouldn't it be fascinating to be able to contrast that, of course, with other organisations? I mean, what an amazing insight into one particular organisation. And I think there's a whole heap of things here. But I'll let some other people go first. Just want to check, Christina, do you want to facilitate the question session, or what would you like to do? Just want to make sure Christine's happy.
I'm trying to get my camera on at the moment. Zoom seems to have changed itself when you use it on the browser. I can't actually use it on my computer because my university has decided that I'm not supposed to have it anymore. So I have to use it on the browser, and it's just decided to change completely the way that it does it on the browser. So I'm really sorry about this, but I'm going to have to remain dark. So yes, I would love to facilitate the session, but somebody had their hand up there a moment ago, but I'm wondering where it's gone.
That was Ian clapping, I think.
Was it?
Thank you, Ian.
Nice.
It was, but I do have a question, if I may, Eleanor. That was really, really interesting. Do you think there was, to any extent, the Hawthorne effect going on here, given that you were actually observing what was going on? Do you think your presence changed any of the behaviour and the approach to tackling these problems?
I like to believe that it didn't, Ian. You know, there is always that question in your mind, am I influencing? I don't mean to be, I don't want to be. But I was a familiar face to this organisation. People were comfortable about me being there because I had previously been employed at Severn Trent. So I had 12 years experience working with these people. I deliberately looked at an area that I knew hadn't previously been exposed to OR and to PSMs. And I was always making quite long-term observations. So for any group of participants, I'd be with them for 4 months.
Right. Okay.
I did also have the experience that people forgot I was there.
Yeah.
And sometimes said things that they really should not have said, possibly again because they sort of trusted me because I'd previously been an employer. But a couple of times I had the experience that I said, really don't show me that, I shouldn't see that. So I do like to think that they just got on with stuff despite me being there.
Great. Can I ask another question?
Of course.
Which is, had they been trained in problem solving and problem structuring methods, would this have been not a wicked or a messy problem? Would they have tackled it differently and not started from a mess?
My belief is that these types of situations would always have had the characteristics of wicked situations. So therefore I would have said that my personal belief would be they would always have been faced with a wicked situation. You could say perhaps that they might have put boundaries on particular parts of it, and if I was to think about the way that PID talks about puzzles, problems and messes, they could perhaps have identified certain parts of things as being puzzles or problems to solve. But I suppose my motivation for doing this research was actually having sort of lived alongside and worked with these people for a long time. I actually thought, do you know what? They're not that bad at structuring problems. I think they're actually quite good at it, but they don't use the methods that we have been taught. They don't use the terminology that we would use to one another. And actually, in my initial stages of fieldwork, I did see puzzles and problems. And I also, this was something I decided not to pursue because you always have to make choices about what you're not going to do. But I could see things being escalated, that somebody or a small group of people within a team might identify something and approach it as though it was a puzzle. But as it hit a wider audience, there'd be questions raised and there'd be a realization that actually this is not a puzzle, it's a problem. Yeah. And then as it got wider, hold on, actually this is a mess.
Everything joins to everything else. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so great. Thank you.
So I do like to think that there was sort of an awareness, although not the type of awareness, not with the terminology that we would use.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much. Really interesting.
I do have a burning question of my own, but I'm going to save it because my job's facilitating. So first of all, we have a question from somebody whose name is in Greek, and I'm sorry, I do not read Greek, so I can't pronounce your name. And they said, thank you for the presentation, very insightful. One question, if you would change one thing in your approach, what would that be in hindsight? Great question.
It is a great question. And of course, hindsight hugely influences what I would say. In hindsight, I would have liked to look at practice. If I had known what I was going to see in terms of practice and this idea that people were aligning with the artifacts, I might have sought specifically to shadow participants in that workplace that I believed were really influencing others in the interpretation that they put on particular company artifacts. So I think if I had done that, I would have been able to delve a little further into this maintenance and evolution of the collective prior appreciation. Of course, I didn't know that in advance, did I? Maybe what I would do next. But thank you very much for the question. It is obviously a good question.
So the next one is from Ben Follows from Gores and HMRC. He says he has a question and a reflection. So Ben, please.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks Eleanor. I thought it was a really fascinating presentation. So as a practitioner in government operational research, I get to worked with a variety of different people and sort of observing them working. And I often thought how fun it would be actually to study that group interaction, which you've done there. My question was about sort of the traditions of the participants. So just to give you a couple of examples, some of the kind of the traditions that I see in government are those that might come from like a PPE or a humanities or a history type background. They tend to try and solve all the problems using a kind of a prose approach. So the first thing they'll do is, let's get a document open. Let's kind of write the story and then fill in the facts afterwards. And that's quite fascinating. Yeah. Contrast that with a like an investigator type approach. They'll say, well, actually, what the real problem is the system's broken. We need to work out where to fix it, for example. And they'll take a very, very different angle into exactly the same problem. Yeah. I wondered if you had come up, had seen anything like that, observed that just the makeup of different groups got them to think about the same problems in very different ways.
Yeah, I would say I saw similar things. I suppose because I was familiar with quite a lot of these participants, you know, I knew their names, I knew their backgrounds, perhaps more than I would have if I'd gone into an organisation that I'd not previously been familiar with. Yes, it's not something I thought about particularly during my fieldwork. I was more concerned with, am I going to be able to demonstrate that they're structuring problems here? Yeah. Because if I couldn't, I had no basis for my comparison. But upon reflection, yes, I would say that there were definitely people who took a more prose approach and people who did this working out where to fix. I would also say that in relation to interpretation of artifacts and willingness to self-generate different types of artifacts, there were definitely differences. The way people interpreted artifacts with this prose approach, they were definitely stronger at interpreting the artifacts and filling in the gaps, if you like. So when there's a gap between the strategic objective and the plans that we currently have in place, how do we make them meet in the middle? It was the people that took this prose approach and sort of enhanced their interpretation of what was already there that were really making a difference to what happened. I also saw quite a lot of people who were thinking, work out where to fix. And yes, that was probably grounded in their existing sort of subject matter expertise, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And I think the final observation is, I think where we come at this from an operational research perspective is that neither of those sort of standard traditions are really comfortable with someone grabbing a pen and saying, do you know what, can I just sort of draw out what we've discussed here? Yeah. I've just, well, there's very few of us I've seen in our organisation who just instinctively do that. But as soon as you do it, everyone's like, oh, I can see where you're coming from now. It's just, it's amazing.
I have maybe 2, possibly 3 participants who would do that. And yeah. The third, I think I don't have very good data on, but I have memories of it, unfortunately. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks a lot for that.
Right. So, Jim, so good to see you. Jim Scholes has a question for you, Eleanor.
I hope you can see me. Nice to see you.
I can see you, yes.
It's so lovely to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, and I really enjoyed the talk. It was fascinating, and
thank you.
I'm sure you appreciate how fortunate you were to get license to go and do the things you did. I think that is rarely the case. I think it's a rare privilege to get that. But I wonder, as you reflect on this, and looking at the experiences you've shared, do you think you were observing problem structuring and problem solving, or were you really observing managers coping with a mess on a daily basis? Now, it's a serious question. It's a serious question because looking at some of your conclusions and the way you've expressed them, I can honestly, as a semi-outsider to some of this, I can honestly relate your observations more closely to the notion that managers are always coping with something of a mess.
Yeah.
And there's an ongoing kind of accommodation, and people take action or don't take action, and it's an ongoing story, you know. And the wickedness, well, wicked problem, I think, is a pretty poor label anyhow. Wickedness isn't really soluble. You know, there will always be something else to be dealt with. And it was just, as you went through that story, I thought, well, it sounds a lot to me, and looking at your models, like, you know, you've had the privilege of observing managers coping with a mess.
Yes.
And they've used, it seems to me, they've used the tools that they've got available, that they've individually learned or feel comfortable with. And you know, as a for example, I mean, if we talk about formal tools, I think, you know, I wouldn't be too uncomfortable personally counting lean as a perfectly understandable way of structuring and solving certain kinds of problems.
Yeah.
So if that's the tool that they've got, if that's what they've been formally taught, then probably we shouldn't be surprised if they try and use what they've been taught.
Yes. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh,
I
yes,
worry
absolutely.
about our labeling of problems and solutions.
I think this is part of the reason I was trying to say I'm not going to look at method, because I think absolutely they were using the tools, the skills, the expertise, the previous experience that they had at their disposal. And yes, I was definitely looking at managers coping with a mess. I was looking at the middle of the organization. So many things I didn't have time to mention, but I was deliberately not looking at executive level. I was looking at the middle, where people have to bring things together and make things happen. But also, you know, at the level where they don't have the autonomy to say, I'm going to spend a couple of £1,000 on getting a consultant in to help us. We've got to do this ourselves. So definitely, I would agree. I was seeing managers cope with mess with the tools they had at their disposal. I would say that they were formulating and solving things simply because that was their means of driving things forward. And what was sort of regulating or creating a rhythm to that driving things forward was actually project management and budget deadlines and so cyclical calendar events, reporting deadlines. That was what was driving the progress. And that's where I think you were seeing the sort of cutoff between time that you could think about what the problem is and time that you had to think, okay, and what are we going to do? What I would say was that right at the end of my research, I was thinking, well, what are the implications? And I was trying to think, what are the most valuable principles or ideas that we have in the PSM world that we would like to usefully push out to these people. And the one that I think might be most important is actually one of the most simple. Simply that you're mandating that for a certain space, a certain time, people make time and space to explore multiple perspectives. That's something that when we design an intervention, we make sure there is time and space for. And we may have to work hard to get commitment to coming to those meetings, to participate. We might work hard as facilitators to keep things going. But we have that opportunity in that controlled environment to say, this is what we're doing for this time, for this next little while. We're holding things open. We're not closing things down. Perhaps that's the most valuable thing that an organisation could say they would do.
That actually feeds perfectly into the one question I had, which I have to be very acutely aware that I am running into our AGM time now.
Sorry.
But it's very much related to that. How much did people actually design these interactions? How much did they think about what they were going to do, what they were wanting to get out of it, and how they needed to approach it, and what sort of approaches they needed to use?
Very, very little. It really was in people's heads. And that's why I had this idea that actually this is a practice. And although I didn't have time to sort of expand upon it here, I was thinking about apprenticeship and membership and credible practice, because I could see that sometimes people whom I knew hadn't been in the organisation for very long, had not become very familiar with some of these extant artefacts, were sometimes very effective at influencing, other times really struggling, because they did not share in this sort of collective initial understanding. So in terms of giving structure to the activities, there were agendas, there were tools used, there were sometimes facilitated sessions, sometimes chaired sessions, sometimes a bit of a bun fight sessions, but I think that's normal in all organisations occasionally. But yes, I think it was far more about experience and practice, and it was very definitely linked to the sort of organisational processes and routines that were going on all the time. So you had no choice really about the format in which you put something forward to a programme board. You had no choice about how you were going to report particular data sets, because it's a very highly regulated industry. So it is interesting, this idea that we could perhaps encourage more attention to design.
Yeah, it's the purposeful model building, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the purposeful model. I think that's and actually understanding what that might mean, and therefore designing to make sure that you are bounded enough that you can capture what you need and that you get some solid outcomes from it. And if you don't have that structure in the first place, you're just going to keep going around the loop, which seems to be exactly what's going on.
Sometimes, not always. Sorry, I just want to go back to Jim and check that I did. I'm not certain I answered the question fully. Just want to be sure.
Hi. Yeah, I thought it was. You answered it to the extent I think it is answerable, because I don't. Okay. Without trying to be unreasonable, I'm not sure it's an answerable question. I'm just interested in your reflections in that sense. I do think there is an issue for people in this kind of group, and I'm not sure that it's soluble, but it is to do with language. Because the notion of problems and solutions, as we all know, wicked situations aren't, don't simply consist of a set of problems. They consist of all the perceptions and all the other things you touched on. And what I wonder might be useful is having some different way of discussing and dealing with situations that are at that end of the spectrum versus more routine problems. I mean, in some sense, I think, my impression of management is that, if you look at management at any level, I think the value added of management is surely that it can deal with problems. Because if you can routinize everything, you don't need management. So I think, we shouldn't be alarmed or surprised if we see managers individually and collectively trying to deal with some kind of problem. Now, where those problems are of a type that's been dealt with many times, we would assume there would be some level of best practice and training. And it may not be surprising, perhaps, that the managers make use of approaches such as lean, which they've probably been taught. There will have been a budget, they'll have been trained, they will continue to use the tools. And I think, as I picked up on some of the conversation, the points you raised around apprenticeship, for example, I think if one could imagine a situation where senior executives thought it was worth putting some money into training budgets,
Mm.
the HR budget for training, and there was some recognition that tools that go beyond the everyday problems could be really useful in helping an organization become better at problem solving.
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily assuming dealing with all the wickedness of problem situations, but actually going beyond the everyday, because I think that's the
Yes.
challenge most
Yeah.
managers in most situations are facing with. What do we do with this? Because it's kind of beyond what we've normally dealt with. And certainly the space that you were in around notions of innovation and innovative ideas, then almost by definition, people are being challenged to go beyond the boundaries of what's already done and what they already know. So yeah, I just wondered if it kind of gives a point of conversation or leverage with senior people. How could they be encouraged to better equip managers to deal with more than the routine?
Yeah.
It all goes in the lean bucket, doesn't it? That's what's my experience anyway. Yeah, everything gets put in lean. We'll get the lean guys to deal with it.
Yeah, but if it's not lean, I mean, there've been plenty of waves, and lean's been, in my view, a wave of I don't similar nature to others that have gone before. I go back in the late 60s. I remember something called clerical work measurement, would you believe? And we had organization and methods and things like that, all of which are great. And there's plenty of method there. There's plenty of structuring and solving.
And theory of constraints.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah.
I'm not taking anything away from any of them, but they are waves. And what tends to get probably less attention than it deserves is the kind of situation that's just been described. It's going beyond the everyday. And how can people be helped to deal with that which is beyond the everyday? Because that's the real challenge that most managers face at most levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep. Thank you ever so much, Eleanor. I've actually got another question from Jane as well, but unfortunately we are now cutting into the time that we had reserved for our AGM. So I suggest, Jane, why don't you email her? I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to hand over to Martin to sort of kick off our AGM activities. Or
perfect. Thanks, Christina. Let me just share a screen for a moment. There we go. So we just begin with a few slides talking about sort of where we've got to and the sort of the progress of developing up our view of taking the SIG activities forward. So this last year, we essentially had a strategy session which Colin Eden was kind enough to facilitate using his strategy finder tool. So not only was it fascinating to look at the outcome, but also we got a brilliant demo of strategy finder, which is an immensely useful approach to dealing with some of the sort of messes that we run into on a regular basis. So we've had that set of diagrams which was circulated last year, and today we're kind of reviewing how to get there. So thinking about sort of what we do, and I think the kind of key themes that came out from the 2022 piece were around guidance for early career researchers and support for state-of-the-art publishing in PSM research. So how can we help and enable that to take place? Links from theory to practice and vice versa. So the all-important, how can we do, well, what we've been doing today, more of looking at how to sort of take the best of the theoretical world and use it, and also what do we do about the work of practice and how to form theory based on practice. So repository of materials and how-to videos and case studies is something that also kind of comes from that. Obviously all the sessions are recorded, so there's recordings of those sessions, but perhaps we want to go a bit broader than just recording the sessions. Maybe we need some sort of intro to systems thinking or whatever it happens to be recorded. And so that's something that's sort of up for discussion. People asked a lot for practical sessions, demonstrations, presentations, methods, tools, approaches, etc., which again I think everyone finds quite sort of useful to see and approach a way that people are approaching a problem, etc. And then mentoring. Mentoring's come up quite a bit. That's something that's being taken forward by the society, and I think within a matter of a few months, we hopefully will have a pilot mentoring scheme in place. So that's not something we're going to take forward within the SIG, but it's something that will be taken forward as we go on. And that's really it. So that was the major set of major topics. And we were just really open to comment on any of those, and what we implementation, what would people like to see, any comments, any views, any suggestions. Please go ahead and feel free to put your hand up or put something in the chat, or just come and talk with us. I guess the first question is, are people content with these as a set of topics? Is there anything that anyone looks at and says, oh, that's not so sure about that, or anything that we've missed that it seems to be important? Ben.
Hi, Martin. Yeah. So my question might be a little naive, given this is sort of the first time coming into one of these sessions. I obviously enjoyed the presentation earlier on. So personally, I come from a very much sort of a practitioner background. Worked in government for 20 odd years. Where I would see some value from that perspective in this sort of environment would be an opportunity to share or talk about case study. So there was definite elements of that in the talk we had earlier on. Maybe if we had an opportunity to talk through the case study, explore the sorts of approaches that were taken, and then sort of challenge the wider group to say, how might you go about it a bit differently? And then otherwise, just as a more of a very general point, again, from our organisation perspective, we're quite good at linking up with statisticians, economists. We're famously good at linking up with economists. I don't think we've been particularly successful in the past linking up with academic colleagues on the operational research side, and I think that's been a real missed opportunity so far. So just a really general point, I'll be looking into ways that we can foster a bit more of a formal relationship, and that way, whether it's I don't know, loans, projects, that sort of thing, that would just bring us together to be able to work on a similar project or in a similar domain. It's that sort of bringing together of, you know, our different perspectives, and as far as possible, sort of foster collaborative working. So I think I've probably just rattled on there a bit, Martin. I don't know how much of that you've already sort of considered and left to the side, or whether maybe one of those ideas are interesting to you or the wider group.
Yeah, absolutely. I think both are very interesting. I mean, the case studies, we've had quite a number of case studies. We had one that was live case studies a little while back, looking at the special education needs and how that can be done. I have a few issues with case studies, particularly live ones, in that, you know, there tends to be quite a lot of sensitive information. So it was kind of quite a sensitive and difficult one, I think, for people to put together, simply because there's quite a lot of places where you can't go. But absolutely, we would be up for definitely having more case studies. I think the links that you suggested, that was something that in a past career I used to do quite a lot of linking up of academia and government. I think the fertile areas are very much around the opportunities to get involved in real activities and the opportunity to demonstrate sort of approaches, methodologies, etc. On real cases. So I think both of those are absolutely right. So I think maybe, Ben, if you've got particular areas that you want to kind of foster links in, feel free to come and do a session, and we can see what the interest is out there within the SIG in terms of sort of working with you.
Don't forget we did Natural Resources Wales this year. So that was a really interesting one, wasn't it?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it was literally throwing it out to the community saying, how are you going to help this guy? What problem structuring could he use? How could
That
he make
sounds
this
really
better?
good. Yeah, that sounds really good.
More
Yeah,
of that stuff then.
yes, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that sounds
And we
great.
definitely, if you've got anything, Ben, that you've got in mind, please just email us, let us know, because it would be really good to invite you in to talk about stuff, or somebody you know who's got a particularly pernicious problem you think could benefit from coming to the community. Or
Yeah,
we
so
could benefit from knowing about it.
yeah, I'll put my thinking hat on. My thoughts are sort of turning to sort of the future of, obviously, HMRC tax. It's the future of tax, which is sort of integrates with the future of business. So it's a bit of sort of future thinking and thinking about implementation issues, that sort of thing. I don't know if that would be of interest.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a lot like the NRW one. Really big, wicked, messy problem. But at the same time, they're trying to find structure within it, and then they're asking questions about how do they do this and how do they do that. And we need to go back to it because we definitely didn't get enough sorted in the session, but I think we will. And having ongoing things like that is just fantastic for this SIG. I mean, it's very much within the spirit of PSMs and being therapeutic and iterations of design and all of that stuff. I'm conscious Eleanor's got her hand up.
Hi, yes. I was wondering, how does the 22-23 content map back to the ideas that we produced at the AGM last year? Because we had that session, didn't we, using the Decision Explorer, the Strategy Finder, the new version of the software.
Yeah, exactly.
and I definitely remember that in the breakout group that I was in, we said we would like to talk about cases of failure. We would like to consider pairing up group members for some shadowing. I don't know how many of these came to fruition because there was an opportunity for them to come to fruition, and how many of them that didn't come to fruition, we perhaps need to just go back to the right people and push to make them happen.
I think when we sort of group these together, I think we put the shadowing under mentoring, which is kind of being taken forward. And I think the cases of failure we put under the case studies. So I think one of the issues we've got is getting anybody to come along and talk about anything that hasn't worked. Certainly if you want me to do a presentation on it, okay. I mean, there's plenty of examples in there, but I just so I don't know how easily we could find people to do that. But I would totally agree with you that sometimes the most fascinating things are that which hasn't worked. Jim's got his hand up here. Would you like to tell us about cases of failure?
Can you hear me? I can't.
I can. Yeah,
can't
absolutely. That's great.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I mean, really, I'm only going to echo what Martin's just said. I think, in my experience in a variety of contexts, for very understandable reasons, people are loath to talk about failures, or they will only talk about failure within, almost within the family, within the company or the organization or whatever. They don't like to share beyond. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons perhaps that, we don't, it's kind of difficult to share examples of failure beyond something like the aviation industry, where failure is routinely reported for good and understandable reasons. But when we look at failures within a corporate environment or a government office, it's very problematic. And similarly, as Martin mentioned earlier, it's very difficult to share case studies where there's significant success. Certainly, in my experience in a commercial environment, companies really do not want to share how they did things that were reasonably successful in practice. Consultants will share it. Case studies will be written by outsiders, but by and large, the people who did it don't share it, at least not in any detail. And there are obvious commercial reasons for that. So it's a great idea, but in practice, it's really difficult.
I think what I found interesting was that last year there seemed to be quite a lot of energy around it, that people wanted to talk about it. So I was thinking, I don't know if we are able to go back and think, well, who expressed an interest, and could we go back to think about, well, how could we do it? Could we talk about failure modes, or sort of what were the characteristics of failure rather than particular examples? I suppose it was really because there was that energy around it last year, not because I think it's easy. Definitely not because I think it's easy, but
yeah. Well, I don't know that now is not the time to resolve it. I think in principle it's it's an idea which many of us would vote for, but it is difficult, and I think it's worth asking why the interest in failure. Is it that what's already been written about failures is insufficient?
Weren't we talking about this years ago, Jim? Weren't we discussing this like a couple of years ago at the beginning of the inception of the SIG? Because we could learn so much if we knew about what worked and what doesn't work.
We could, but it ain't that easy, and that's essentially what I think we've been touching on. I mean, there are some, examples. The aviation industry learns a lot through failure, and hence reduces the probability of accident. We could have a lively discussion about the extent to which healthcare ought to follow a similar model, but doesn't. But it's really difficult to get in there at the level of individual case studies. I think at a general level maybe there's something could be done, but I found it difficult anyhow. Sorry, that's not a very helpful comment, but I can understand the interest, but I'm not sure how to do it.
Yeah.
So I think what we can do is we can keep that as an action, both the shadowing and the failure. We can keep track of it, and we can sort of put our thinking caps on in terms of ways of being able to do it. When I was thinking of a sort of round table forum for the failure one, where you kind of talk about I've got a friend who had a problem with whatever it was, and Alcoholics Anonymous style.
Yeah. Sorry, Martin, if I may quickly just build on that, it occurred to me as we were talking that perhaps a way into this would be to have folks come along and express problems that they're dealing with. Because if you can declare the problem that you're dealing with, there is an implicit failure to have dealt with that problem already. And there is probably a little bit of history as to why it's not worked out so far. And it's perhaps easier for other practitioners to then share their experience in relation to that situation, rather than making a case study of what they have done. Does that make sense? So
that's exactly why NRW came to us.
Yeah.
Because they were having a real problem with certain aspects of what they're dealing with, and that's why they came to us in the first place. So actually, you're absolutely right. There is a failure implicit in the fact that they need to come to us to talk to us because they haven't been able to solve it themselves. So actually, that does show an area where they are falling down and finding things difficult. Yeah.
And I think it makes it easier also, Christina, then to, from external examples, to relate elements of those examples without having to provide a full and probably confidential case study.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really interesting. It's how to approach that. We'll have to think about that, Martin. Thinking caps on there, mate.
Definitely. Excellent. Anything else that anyone wants to add to this? Essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to use this as our starting point to build the program for the year ahead. There's been quite an interest in sort of reinvigorating some of the SIGs. I think some SIGs have met more often than others. This one has met quite a lot over the sort of last few years, and thanks particularly to Jim, to Christina, and others for helping to organise that.
And to Martin.
He's
not going to say thank you to himself, yeah.
And so I think we're really looking at what the best structure is for the program as we go forward. We're looking to try and outline a program for a longer period of time. So instead of you getting maybe a few weeks of notice, you're getting hopefully a few months of notice of things that are coming up, which makes it easier to put it into the diaries, etc. And so we're sort of formalizing this much more as we go ahead. And this is helping us enormously. This is giving us some of that sort of, okay, so who is it that we should be looking for? What perspective should we be looking for? And what do we want to really reinforce as we go forward?
The other thing that the OR Society has been putting forward is that they would actually like to have a couple of published pieces a year. So if anybody's got anything that burning that they would really love to put out on problem structuring that perhaps isn't of a quality that you would put out into one of the major journals, but is something that, or is preliminary research that actually would be great to put out as something, then maybe consider coming and giving us a talk and doing a little piece about it or something like that. One of the ideas that I'd had around the sort of support for state-of-the-art publishing in PSM research is there's been a couple of papers out recently that are research and practice papers. So they're huge papers written by many, many co-authors. Fotios Petropoulos has been leading them. And he's done one in International Journal of Forecasting, which was on forecasting theory and practice. And there's been one on operational research theory and practice. And I think it would be absolutely wonderful to see soft OR and problem structuring theory and practice written by a very large cohort of people who are both from practice and from academia and do theory. So if anybody's interested in coming in on that, please let me know. I will attempt to edit it. It's going to have to be me and Martin, I'm afraid, because Martin, you're going to have to come in on this because you are the practice person. So we have to do it together, yeah. But it seems to me that that would really help to stamp what we do with the level of importance that it deserves, as opposed to being something that was in the operational research paper. I think having a standalone paper on its own would be a fantastic thing. It will take many authors and it will take a lot of editing, but obviously the sooner we can get it out while these things are sort of hot and they've happened, the better. If people are interested, and if I get enough interest off of people, I will approach the Journal of the Operational Research Society and see if they would be interested in publishing a paper like that. So please get in touch with me if you think that that's something that you could contribute to.
I think it would be amazing. Yeah, I think we just need that group of, as you say, that broad group of people. It's quite a major undertaking if you're going to do it with just a very small group, but with a large group, it becomes a whole lot easier. Awesome. So unless anyone else has anything we want to share, I think we're pretty much there on the agenda. Christina, is there anything else that you wanted to cover for the AGM?
No, these were definitely things that came forward from what we did last year. These were the main themes that bubbled up from everything that was discussed. So, you know, we're just putting back to the community what they've told us that they want. I think the repository thing has been something since we started that we've been wanting to develop, and we're getting there slowly but surely. But the OR Society is also evolving. So, you know, everything evolves alongside it, which is great, isn't it?
Absolutely, that's brilliant. Thanks so much, Eleanor, for a fantastic presentation. I've got a whole lot of questions I'll ask you at some point via email. Thanks everyone for all your contributions following Eleanor's presentation and to the AGM. So it's just about 6:30 now, so I think it's probably time to stop. So we will, I'm sure, catch up with you at the next event.